The crowd was listening open-mouthed, seized with misgivings, when Etienne, who had been following the scene, jumped onto the fallen tree and stood up beside the old man. He had just recognised Cheval among his friends in the front row. The idea that Catherine must be there had rekindled his passion, with a desire to be applauded before her very eyes. "Comrades, now you've heard what one of our elders has suffered, and what our children will suffer, if we don't put a stop to these thieves and assassins." He was implacable. Never had he spoken so violently. He held on to Bonmore with one arm, displaying him like an emblem of poverty and mourning, crying for vengeance. In a few rapid phrases, he ran through the fate of the Maheu family. From their beginnings, worn out by the mine, devoured by the company, still starving after 100 years of hard labour, and he contrasted this with the board of directors, sitting there with bloated bellies, positively dripping with money, and the whole crew of shareholders, kept in luxury for 100 years like fancy women with no need to work, just pampering their bodies. Wasn't it horrifying? A whole race of men dying below ground from father to son, just to help out government ministers with their expense accounts, and to enable generations of nobles and bourgeois to throw parties or grow fat staying at home by the fireside. He had studied the diseases of miners, and he listed them, one by one, in all their horrifying detail. Anemia, scrofula, the black phlegm of bronchitis, suffocation from asthma, paralysis from rheumatism. These wretched folk, thrown as fodder to the machines, herded like cattle into the mining villages, were gradually absorbed by the big companies who regulated their slavery, threatening to enlist all the workers of the nation, all their millions of arms, for the wealth of a few thousand layabouts. But the miner was no longer an ignorant brute, trodden down into the depths of the earth. Deep down in the mines an army was growing, a future crop of citizens, germinating like seeds that would burst through the earth's crust one day into the bright sunshine. And then they would see if, after 40 years of service, they dared offer a 150-franc pension to an old man of 60, whose guts were full of coal and whose legs were pickled in the water that gushed from the coalface. Oh yeah, Labour would call capital to account, challenging the anonymous god who lay hidden in his mysterious tabernacle somewhere out of sight of the workers, gorged on the blood of the sick and dying that he fed on. They would go to find him. They would see his face lit clearly at last in the blaze of his dwelling as it burnt to the ground. He would drown in his own blood like a filthy swine, that foul idol that fed on human flesh. He fell silent, his arms still stretching into the darkness, challenging the enemy out there, wherever he might be, even at the other end of the earth. This time the clamour of the crowd was so loud that the good citizens of Montsou heard it, and looked out towards Vendôme, quaking with fear at the thought of some awful rockfall. The birds of the night wheeled over the woods, silhouetted against the great white sky. He decided to conclude immediately. "Comrades, what is your decision? Do you vote to continue the strike?" "Yes, we do," the voices screamed. "And what measures will you take? We are sure to lose if any cowards go back down to work tomorrow." Voices were raised again in a tempestuous blast. "Death to all cowards!" So you decide to remind them of their duty, of their solemn oath. "This is what we can do. Go to the pits, persuade the traitors to join us, show the company that we are united and that we will die rather than yield." "He's right! To the pits! To the pits!" All the while he had been speaking, Etienne had been seeking out Catherine's face among the mass of pale, turbulent figures swaying before him. He was sure she wasn't there, but he could still see Cheval, who was sneering and shrugging his shoulders ostentatiously, consumed with jealousy, ready to sell his soul for a taste of such popularity. "And if there are any spies among us, comrades," Etienne continued, "they had better watch out. We know who they are. Yeah, I can see some colliers from Vendôme who haven't left their pit yet." "Do you mean me?" asked Cheval with an air of bravado. "You or anyone like you. But since you've spoken, you should understand that people with enough to eat have nothing to tell those who go hungry. You're working at Jean Bart. A raucous voice interrupted. Oh, you could say he's working. Or you could say he's found a woman to go to work for him. Cheval's face flushed, and he swore. For God's sake! Is it a crime to work, then? Yes, cried Etienne. When your comrades are starving for the good of their neighbours, it's a crime to be selfish and suck up to the bosses. If the strike had been general, we would have mastered them long ago. Should any man from Vendôme have gone down to work when Montsou was out on strike? The best thing would have been for work to stop all over the region. At Monsieur Deneulans as well as here. Do you hear? You're nothing but traitors at the coalface at Jean Bart. You're all traitors. Around Cheval the crowd became threatening. Fists were raised, and cries of "Kill them! Kill them!" started to ring out. He went pale. But in his furious urge to get the better of Etienne, he was inspired by a new idea. Just listen to me now. Come to Jean Bart tomorrow and you'll see if I'm working. We're on your side. They sent me to tell you. We must put out the furnaces, and the mechanics too must come out on strike. I don't care if that makes the pumps stop. The water will ruin the pits, and that'll put an end to the whole bloody farce. He was applauded wildly in his turn, and from then on Etienne lost control of the meeting. Speaker after speaker stood on the tree trunk, gesticulated amid the uproar, making wild proposals. They were possessed with the divine folly of inspired believers, the impatience of a religious sect which, tired of waiting for the promised miracle to happen, decides to accomplish it unaided. They saw red, as their heads were light with hunger and spinning with visions of fire and slaughter, of a glorious apotheosis from which universal happiness would arise. The tranquil moonlight bathed this ocean swell, and the depths of the forest swathed their murderous cries in its silence. The only sound to be heard was the crunching of frozen moss beneath their feet, while the beeches, rising straight and strong, with the delicate tracery of their branches standing out darkly against the white sky, were deaf and blind to the miserable wretches surging at their feet. As the crowd ebbed and flowed, La Maheude found herself next to Maheu, and both of them, taking leave of their senses, carried away by the gradually rising exasperation that had been racking them for months, applauded Levaque, who was asking for the heads of the engineers. Pierron had disappeared, and Bonmort and Muc were both talking at once, saying confused but violent things which nobody followed. For a laugh, Zachary called for the churches to be demolished, while Mouquet struck at the ground with his cross club for the sheer pleasure of making even more noise. The women were like furies. La Levaque, with her hands on her hips, flew at Philomène, accusing her of laughing. La Mouquette said she would kick the gendarmes to pieces where it hurt most. Old Ma Brûlé, who had just slapped Liddy for turning up with no salad and no basket, started thrashing the air around her, aiming punches at all the bosses that she would have liked to get hold of. For a moment, Jeanlin had felt stunned, for a pit boy had told Bébert that Madame Rasseneur had seen them steal Poland. But having decided that he'd go back on the sly to let the creature go free near the door of the Avantage, he shouted even louder, drew out his new knife and made it spring open, brandishing its shining blade with pride. "Comrades, comrades," repeated Etienne, exhausted and hoarse from trying to obtain peace and quiet for a moment to get them to agree to take a final decision. At last they agreed to listen. "Comrades, tomorrow morning at Jean Bart, is that agreed?" "Yeah, you bet. Jean Bart, here we come. Death to all traitors." The tempest of their 3,000 voices filled the heavens and gradually dissolved in the clear, bright moonlight.